Welcome, everybody, to the February edition of the webinar. My name is Mark Murrell. What am I currently? I'm the president of CarriersEdge. And I am joined today by two people that I'm always very excited to talk to. Our CEO, Jazrawy, and our Director of Content Services, Tiffany Cancian. So today we are going to talk about the very thrilling subject of content and how to make content interesting. This is always a subject that I'm fascinated by because I have no clue how to do it. But yet I see the things that the content team put out, and it always strikes me as being very surprising the way that they sort of sift through all of the content, figure out what to include, what not to include, how to organize it, and put all of the different pieces in place, and then find ways to make it real for people, give some examples, some context, some stories, and make it something that is both engaging and memorable for everybody who's going through it. And since I'm clueless in how all of that works, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk to them about how they do it. It's also prompted by some recent things that we've done, or not we, because it certainly wasn't me, but the content team has done, taking some different approaches to some new courses. I think it was last summer, we launched the overhauled defensive driving course that kind of had a graphic novel vibe to it, sort of looking at characters and taking these kind of mentors through the story with the participant going through it. And I know you're getting close to being complete on an overhauled dangerous goods course, which has a kind of mystery game approach to it. So I want to start by asking, for both of those courses, and I'm just going to sort of throw this out to both of you, what prompted you to go in those different directions, and what did you see as the benefits for the audience if you take that approach or a different approach to the training courses? Open for anybody.
I'll start because I'm going to pass it over to Tiff pretty quickly. When I originally did the courses, and I have to say, when I originally started writing the courses for CarriersEdge, I was very against stories, and most of it was because I was doing it by myself, and so the entire course was me. And putting a story on top of the information was almost a bridge too far. So Mark was always saying, what about the story? What about the story? And he'd be like, oh, fine, I'll do the story. And then I'd write the story. But when Tiffany came on board, she was looking at the courses that I'd already developed. And so part of that design was already done. So she was looking at courses, full complete courses rather than bits of information, which is what I was working with. So, and you can't really go from scratch to 100 miles an hour in this kind of thing. You kind of have to do it in iterations. But when Tiffany look at defensive driving for the first one, she has a really great ability to look at it differently and look at it as a storyteller more than just an information provider, which I tend to be more on the information provider type side. So for everybody who just likes to deliver information, I'm right there with you. But Tiff is a storyteller and does a lot of creative writing on the side, or as her real thing, and then she does my work on the side. So I'll let you talk about your process, Tiff.
Sure. So for defensive driving, well, one, I love stories because they give you a way to bring the content to life, and they also make it easier for the learner to remember it. So if you're learning about a subject, it's more easy to remember a story about somebody who went through that subject, because we've been passing down stories since the dawn of time, and it's kind of hardwired in our brains to remember it better. So when I'm looking at a course, and defensive driving was one example, I started writing it and I just thought, oh my gosh, this is so boring. Everybody knows this stuff, or who knows parts of this stuff. And I was just really trying to find a way to bring it to life. And I love to take inspiration from other things, other stories, other videos, other learning scenarios, just TV in general. And I was looking at different types of, I think there's like 7 main story types. And one of them was the hero's journey. So thinking about somebody who's going through trials and adversity and they're trying to achieve a final goal, and they're coming over all these obstacles on the way there. And I thought, hey, that would be a really cool idea to apply to defensive driving and take all those tactics and make that part of the hero's journey. So decided that the character in the story would have one critical delivery to make. And in order to do that, they needed to, learn how to back and park and manage their space and navigate hills and turns and curves properly. And as we were going through that, I was actually working with a bit of existing content we had. And this is something that Jane had incorporated, was that there was different factors that affect your driving. There's, the human factor, stuff in your control, like how you're feeling that day, your fatigue, as well as mechanical factors. So your vehicle and how that's operating. And as part of the hero's journey, I thought these factors could actually be like mentors that follow the character. And that's kind of how the graphic novel spin got put into it. And our graphic designer kind of took that theme and then created these beautiful characters to be the mentors that support the character on their journey.
That's interesting. So the hero's journey approach to the story kind of fits in with a graphic novel model and sort of leads into that pretty nicely. Now, you mentioned stories being sort of an integral part of how we as humans learn things and remember things, but going alongside that is the character side of it. So in every one of our courses, there is always characters, and that's part of what I was always badgering Jane about. She did it once in one course, and I thought it was fabulous. So I was really badgering her to do it in every other course after that. But the characters, I think one of the critical things for a character and a story to be meaningful and relatable is that it has to be something that is relevant for the audience. So it has to be a relatable character. They have to be able to see themselves in that. So can you talk a little bit about how you do that when you're creating the characters of the stories, when you're or choosing the stories when you're writing some of these courses?
Go ahead. You go ahead, Tiff.
I was going to say, in terms of writing the characters, one tool that I really like to use them for is working through more challenging information. So when the learner is learning alongside a character, they don't feel so alone, and you can make that character go through difficulties. And so the learner feels more engaged because somebody also understands the challenges in performing or doing the task, and it helps them connect better with that and be able to understand that, see that somebody else might be struggling with it or somebody else is learning with it, and it helps build that engagement that way, and it kind of creates a safer space to learn the material.
And it also helps you learn the material, right? It's got you, there's a couple of things that I just wanted to add to that, is that when you separate it into a third person, or like there's another person who's going through, making the mistakes, going through the trauma, doing all of that, it does give you that sort of sense of removing. And instead of saying, you don't you do this, and like you're not doing sort of this, pushing it right onto the person taking the course. There's like this sense of responsibility that's been shifted for a bit, where you have the opportunity to learn, and that you can't feel like, well, it's much more difficult for people to learn when they're feeling stressed or under pressure. And if they don't understand, and the person in the course is, just going through it, zipping through it with no problem, then that's going to give you a feeling of failure, and you just don't want to do that. And this is all very, very subtle. I mean, we don't do super amounts of story because we don't have enough space and time and things like that. It doesn't have to be really overt, like you don't have to have 3 paragraphs of the mentors talking about this defensive driving. You just have to put in it a little bit and sort of drip it over time. And you just get the feeling overall of the feeling of the whole course changes when you do that. That whole story just becomes a little less formidable, a little less didactic. It becomes a little bit more friendly. But the other thing that is really good when you're working through the information is you get the sense you're trying to build a relationship with the person taking the course, which is difficult when you're doing online, but because you have to understand what that person's day is like. And this is where I come in, and I'm kind of the de facto subject matter expert in CarriersEdge just because I've been writing these courses for so long. But there's a lot of very subtle things that people who are not coming from the trekking industry don't know. And they will kind of add this to their stories, and it'll be like, no, nobody's doing that ever. Or that's never going to happen. It's actually more like this. So write your story this way. And then that makes it more realistic to the drivers who are taking the courses. They don't feel like, well, this person doesn't know what my day is really like. We do know kind of what their day is really like because we do all the best fleets work. We talk to drivers all the time, or talk to drivers and carriers all the time. So we have a sense of what it should look like as a day in the life.
There's something else that you kind of touched on a little bit and you sort of glossed over that I think is important to discuss here. And that is what you're describing as sort of that approach is very different than kind of a traditional course creation method. A sort of a traditional method of building training courses, particularly on regulatory subjects, is you start with the regulations. You look through the regulations, you change it from legalese into human language, and then you put out your content. That's the content based on that. And that's kind of how reference books. Slap it in a
PowerPoint deck.
Yeah, that's how PowerPoint is often built. It's how reference books are built. But there's a couple of challenges with that. And, one of them that I want to cover later is that regulations are almost always in the wrong order. But just as important, there are gaps. There are always challenges or gaps or things that weren't really covered. And when you flip it into a story, I've noticed this and watching you guys build courses for years, you start to identify those, because when you turn those regulations into a day in the life for a driver, you start thinking, okay, what is the first thing they do? Okay, what do they do after that? And then, oh, what does it mean? What does this mean? How does this actually work? You end up in those places where you have to go and find all of these other bits of information. So can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges? And Jane, I know you've had a lot of work in that area where you've had to just go and see, well, what is it that people are supposed to be doing at this stage? Because nobody ever talks about it. People talk about step 1 and step 3, but nobody talks about step 2. So how have you dealt with that?
This is where my SMEs come in so handy, subject matter experts. I've been closing gaps since I started doing this. When I was a consultant, there's always gaps. People will always forget or take for granted certain information that everybody knows it, and they just kind of gloss over it. So, but when you're doing training, when you're writing a training course and you're trying to do all the steps, when you think about it, and you have to actually think about the steps and what they look like. If you don't do that, then a lot of people just kind of copy and paste into some sort of online training software, and it doesn't help, right? You still have the gaps. But if you're actually thinking about, okay, this is step 1, this is step 2, and then, hey, wait a minute, how did you get there from, how do you get this way? Then that's when you have to go and say, okay, how does this happen? And sometimes there isn't a process, or sometimes no one has thought of it. So sometimes you are kind of the training hero. You figured out that there's this huge gap. I remember doing a course for a big retailer, and it was a course on fraud. And so if you get a fraudulent banknote, and my question was, okay, well, what do you do with it? I mean, I know what the process is, the paperwork that you have to do, but what do you actually physically do with your $50 bill that you think is counterfeit? And we went back to the client, and the client didn't know. And they didn't tell us for 5 years. It was really bizarre. But so what I do now, because I have a little bit more control, I'm not doing client work anymore, is those are the questions that we do mostly at photo shoots. So often the questions happen during, and we go and take photos on site. And this is it's an awesome opportunity to just basically ask questions, because the people who are helping us with the photo shoot are often safety professionals, and they will just start talking. And you just want to follow them around the tape recorder, because just the knowledge that comes out of their mouths is insane. It could write, and it's not written down anywhere. So it's so valuable. We're taking the pictures, we're listening to people talk about what they know so well. And then we scurry back to our desks and try and make sure we get it all in. And that's pretty much, it's asking the question, how do you get from point A to point B? And then basically getting as much of the answer as you possibly can. And like I think Tiff said, that there's a lot of oral tradition in trucking, and there's so much knowledge that's trapped in people's brains that I'm just dying to, pull out and get written down and get documented. One of the best examples, the one that I always think of, is that during a vehicle inspection, how do you turn on the lights? Like, this is a question that I have the answer to, but how do you inspect whether the lights are working or not? And when do you turn them on? Do you turn them on? Do you look at everything and then go and turn them on? And when do you do the brakes? And how does all of that happen? In my head, when I was writing the course, I could not figure it out. It's like, how do you do that? When do you do that?
It's not written down anywhere. People itemize the specific things that need to be inspected and what to look for, but nobody really gives an end-to-end process of start with this and then do this. But you go on site and watch them conduct an inspection, you'll see it.
The other thing
Exactly.
is that what is written down is generally in passive voice. So when you take that information and you try to write about it in active voice, you're forced to answer these questions that aren't answered. So for example, if a document must, in the regulations might say the inspection report must be submitted each day. So you take that's in passive voice, and try to put it into active voice, and you're forced to answer the question, okay, you must submit the inspection report every day. And then you're thinking about, okay, who's it going to go to? And maybe the inspection report isn't a great example, but a lot of the regulations are written in passive. And when you're trying to write it in an active voice, which is someone does something, you're forced to think about those gaps that are missing. And that's also a really great tool to help identify those.
I was going to ask you about that actually specifically, because I know that's one of the challenges. Like you say, the oral tradition, there's so many things that aren't written down that you end up having to go and interview like 5 different people who do that and just sort of compile it and see where the commonality is. But then when you do look at the things that are written down, it's so passive that it's really not clear who's supposed to be doing it and what the process should look like.
And I think in the industry, and not just trucking, I think this is everywhere, there are certain things where it's so passive that everybody just kind of assumes that it's either the other person. So drivers assume that's the carrier's responsibility, or the carriers assume that it's the driver's responsibility, and no one clarifies it. So that's when people get into trouble. They have for inspections, they didn't realize that they had to replace the lights, or the driver didn't realize that he was supposed to replace the light. I know that isn't necessarily true, but I'm just using it as an example. And then there's a fine, and then the carrier is saying, well, why didn't you do this? And the driver is saying, well, why didn't you tell me? And then there's just bad blood there. So when you have everything in active voice, it's very clear who is responsible for what, because the driver is responsible for, rather than the document must be submitted, which said there's no one who says that. So anytime you see where there's there's no person involved in the sentence, where something has to be done but no person actually does it, that's passive voice, and that needs to be corrected. All you need to do is find out who is responsible for doing what and flip your sentence around. And we are taught through high school to write in passive voice. We are always told that it seems more grown up, and people actually talk in passive voice sometimes too. And it becomes very difficult to follow a conversation where passive voice is used, because it tends to not make sense, but nobody will say anything to say, this doesn't make sense, I don't understand. So it's a very good way to defend yourself when you don't want to take response, or you think that the responsibility is not yours, or that kind of thing. And so that happens in the corporate world quite a bit, but it also happens in trucking, especially when people don't see each other. So when you have that kind of passive language around instructions, people can get really confused.
One does find it difficult to follow along when passive voice is used for instruction. Yes.
No,
that's a great example of a passive voice sentence, because there's no person, there's no individual, which is, like Jane says, that's exactly how you're told in high school, in post-secondary. You're instructed to write in a particular way, which is super passive, but it's unhelpful, and it just muddies all of the training content.
Writing is required to be done in a specific way.
Yeah.
There you go. There's passive. No one's actually doing anything.
So moving back into the active world, once you as content creators have decided what needs to be done, how do you decide what the right level of detail is to include? I mean, regulations will go into minute details in all kinds of areas. And if you talk to safety professionals, you talk to drivers, you talk to people that are doing these things, they can end up going down rat holes in like all kinds of things in very specific areas that don't necessarily apply. So how do you know how much detail to include for the audience in a particular situation?
Only I know how much detail. That's what the team would say.
Yeah,
only Jane. I asked Jane, and no one else knows. When you start, and the word rabbit hole in our world, in content creation world, is, we talk about it quite a bit. I love rabbit holes. I think they're not a bad thing. If you want to go down them, because you're going to learn something. The problem, the thing is, you have to figure out when the rabbit hole is going to be research for more than one course, or maybe for this course. And what happens is, we often put more information into the course than is really required, and then cut from there. It's much easier to get rid of information than there is to add it in after, although that happens too. I tend to try and it's kind of, you kind of get a sense for it. So you start with too much information, and then when you go and look at the course online, and it's just like, no, you don't need that. You don't need that. You don't need that. So it's a lot easier to chop. And I've kind of done it for so long, I've got a sense of it. But Tiff, do you have any, since I've chopped some of your stuff?
Yeah, I like to err on the side of caution. Well, part of it too is we like to explain things, because when you tell somebody why something's important, they're more likely to do it. So it does build that sense of, it gives them more empowerment, right? Because they know they're not just being told to do something, they're being told something's important, and now they understand why. So we do like to add detail in that sense, even though it may not be super necessary. It is helpful for the learner to get that outcome that you're looking for. So if you do want them to do a safety inspection, they have to understand why it's important and what, those pieces are. But definitely, we do like to err on the side of caution, include more stuff. And then part of it too goes back to what Jane was saying about finding people to ask and seeing, okay, does a driver need to know this for their everyday? Is this important? We think it might be, we're not sure. Let's ask somebody.
Is that kind of the foundation that you start with, what a driver needs on a regular day-to-day basis?
No, that's don't know where I start.
Or
that's
is that where you end up? Sorry, that's what I meant. Is that's kind of the basic criteria, is looking at sort of the average daily experience of the driver.
the way that I do it, and I'm pretty sure Tiffany does it, correct me if I'm wrong, Tiff, but the way I do it is you find all the information about the subject first. If you're thinking about a story to put on it, that's great. If not, it doesn't really matter. The first thing you want to know is what the information is. So vehicle inspection, mental health, like hours of service, whatever it is. And then you kind of piece together all the information, figure out the order it should be talked about. And then and that order is often influenced by the driver's day. So you need to have a foundation of what the information is before you start adding a story to it. The story can only come when you understand, for example, hours of service. You're never gonna be able to put it into a story if you don't understand it. Does that kind of...
The story and the final pieces help filter out the detail that's not important.
Okay. So that's another place where the story helps you to keep it at the same level, is you're going into as much detail in every section sort of consistently, but based on what the story is dictating.
Yeah. And also sometimes we may be very attached to a particular bit of information. And so you'll start out with a page, and Tiff knows this, and it'll end up as a pop-up. It'll end up as just being like one paragraph, because even though it's a really interesting part of the content, and I think this was for diet, I think Tiff really got into some stuff with diet, the diet course. And it was like, you know what? I understand this is really good information, but it might be a little too much. So let's just make it a pop-up. And so there is, or for more information, that's another place that will, things that we like that we can't include, that's where they go.
So it's not about necessarily chopping things out completely. You may reduce the focus on some things. You may increase the focus on some others. There may be sort of different weighting giving to things as you put your pieces together.
They're often in content, the refrain is, nope, that's a page. Nope, that's a pop-up. Nope, that's a page.
Okay.
Depending on its importance, right? So if you're talking about something like, I can't even remember now, the things that like the most common vehicle inspection problems, which is brakes, lights, and tires, that's a page. That's not a pop-up. Like that, you want to have a page explaining what those three things are. That's your intro page. And then you can go into the details. But if you start with the details about how there's so many problems with tires and you have to watch for all of these things, and then you have to go back to, and lights too. And then you go back into all the details about lights, and then you come out, and then you don't have an overview of it. So you have to start with that big picture, and that will help you decide where the detail goes.
Interesting. And you glossed over something a couple of times. You've made reference to this, and I want to spend a bit of time talking about it, the order of the information. So, we talked in the beginning about how the regulations are pretty much always in backwards order. And you said sort of looking at the order of the information based on the driver's day. So let's talk a little bit about how you do that. I mean, you start with regulations. What do you mean when we say that things are kind of in the backwards order? What is it about the regulations that makes them backwards?
Well, they start with the exceptions a lot of the time. They don't start in a logical order. They start in the order that they're talking about it for the purposes of the law. They're not talking about it in terms of somebody's day. Oh, I'm just looking at somebody sent me something. I have to look at it in a minute, Charles. So what happens is, okay, so for a vehicle and inspection report, there's a lot of rules about what goes into a vehicle inspection report, what goes into submitting a vehicle inspection report, what are the things that you have to inspect. And the rules are in all these different places about, especially in the US. You look at Canada and the US, and they're also not quite the same. So you have to figure out, okay, well, do people need to know what items to inspect? Do they need to know the paperwork? Do they need to know, like, you know, how to do, like, how to walk around the vehicle? In what order do you do that? There are so many different parts of it, and the regulations will do it in a way that's really not, it's not easy to grasp, because they want to do it in a way that they make sure that all the legalese is, you know, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. It's like, so that if it needs to go to a court, then it means something. But when you're talking about it for human beings, then you have to sort out which parts go where. And if it depends on the regulation, but some of them, a lot of them start with the glossary, which is the worst way to do any course. Like, I'm telling you, do not give people a list of definitions first, because that, you just see the definitions and you know that boredom is going to happen. And every time I see a list of definitions, I'm just like, no, why did they do that? But that's how the regulations start, because they have to define what is happening in the regulations. Like, that makes sense. So that's why I think you have to take the information and then put it in a big pile and then sort it out yourself and figure out, okay, what's going to make sense to me? Because you can create the framework as you write the course. You can create your own framework of how things should work. You just have to communicate that. So if you create, so for example, for accident scene, I had these lists of like 50 things to do. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to do a course that just lists 50 things to do. I'm going to break it up. So how do I group all of these things? And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time on, is how do you group something so that it's easier to digest? And so I grouped it into 4, like out of like literally 35 to 50 things, I grouped it into 4. And then once you do that, then you can start saying, okay, step 1, stop. What are all the things you have to do at an accident scene that relates to the first things that you do? So you stop, you put out your, you put your hazards on, you put out your cone or your safety triangles, blah, 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 blah. That's, so I decided that's how I wanted to do it. And as long as you tell people how you want to organize it, and it makes sense to you, you can generally communicate it pretty well.
Jane, you said something to me when I first started, when we were talking about structuring a course. And I was like, how do you decide kind of what goes together? And you told me to think of the information as pieces of money and take all the dollars and put them together, and all the quarters and put them together, and, you know, all the dimes and put them together. So when you're looking at the regulations, you're kind of looking for, okay, where are my dollars? Where are my quarters? And then taking those and chunking them into pieces. And I found that was a really useful tip of information to help
that is
break that
fantastic.
structure.
I totally forgot I said that.
I did not. I remembered it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm writing that down. I love it.
Yeah. Okay. Apparently I said it, so I'm going to take credit for it.
Well, it really helped, because when I look at something now, I do think about that. Like, okay, where are all the dollars? Where are all the quarters? And then taking those and putting them together.
I think that's probably the best part of this entire hour that you brought that up. I think it's because it's true. You want to look for the biggest bang for your buck, and then you dribble down into the smaller things.
Yeah, interesting. So once you have all of that content and you figured out the order for it, how do you decide what's going to be the best learning activity for different subject areas? So sometimes I know you guys will have exercises that may just be simple kind of multiple choice questions. Sometimes you'll be putting things in a particular order. Sometimes it's drag and drop. Sometimes there's a scenario. How do you decide on what activities to use?
Well, like you said, putting something in a specific order, that's great for any procedure. So anytime you have, like Jane said, maybe a vehicle inspection where you need to go step by step, you want people to remember what those steps are. So being able to drag and drop the steps in order is really, really useful. And when we have a lot of terms and definitions, so instead of a glossary at the beginning, we might do something like a drag and drop where you have to match the word to the definition. So that might be helpful for something like WMIS, where you're trying to remember the hazard and what it is. So those kind of associations would go really well together.
Interesting.
The activities will, it's weird. I feel like one of these people who talks about how the wood speaks to you and tells you what you want to carve out of it. But the information does kind of lend itself to different activities. So if there's something like a drag and drop, but if it's something where only one thing is true and people get confused about it a lot, then that's a really good multiple choice. Because you can have statements that are similar, but only one is true. So, but I do like the things that we're doing now where we're more interactive, I like a lot better. So we have a good we're redoing the distracted driving course, but we have a really good couple of interactive exercises that we're getting help from the platform team on doing, which I'm very interested in. I'm very happy about that. The other thing is like self-evaluations. That's another thing where if you're talking about, do you want to know if you're overweight or what your BMI is, or if you want to know something about yourself and you want to do basically like a little checklist, then I think that's a really good tool as well, especially if we've given people a lot of information about how to identify things, then having an exercise where you can go and select different things and get a response, kind of like a magazine quiz type of thing, where you find out, what your favorite chocolate is for Valentine's Day. I nearly said Halloween.
Yeah.
I think too, Jane, going what you said off of how the content speaks to you, part of that too is the learning objective. So it's going back to what you want the learner to be able to do at the end of the course and building those interactions to generate that outcome. So if you do want to have somebody identify, let's just take an example of identify errors on a document. I don't know. Maybe the activity would be to have that document and have a list of options that would potentially be errors. So they're actually doing the thing you want them to do. If it's, for example, maybe they need to be able to explain the importance of something. Well, that might be a good multiple choice question because they can select the answer that explains the importance of performing a certain action.
That's a really interesting kind of approach. I think a lot of times when people are doing quizzes, they're sort of writing quizzes for the sake of having a question, and they don't necessarily think about the objectives or the outcomes that they're after, and that's where you end up with a lot of true or false questions. That'll just be a bunch of statements from the content and with a true or false question at the end of it, and that really doesn't tell you very much. But if you think about the thing that you want somebody to be able to do, you're going to be in a better place to be able to evaluate that. So I think what you're saying is try and get the actual work in there wherever possible. So like you say, the document based on evaluating documents, and get them to evaluate a document. If they need to do things in a particular order, get them some sort of a process activity where they have to put things in the right order. So. Yeah,
and going back to that vehicle inspection example, that's probably a better one than examining a document. But in I think one of our checkpoint questions is, so-and-so finds this defect on their vehicle. Use Schedule 1 and select the defect item that they should write on their vehicle inspection report. And the objective is to record defects on your vehicle inspection report.
And one of the things that I find really, really useful when people are creating content is, what is the thing that you want to solve? So what is the one problem if you are doing anything in training and you're doing it for a reason, right? So you're either the regs are changing or you're seeing a problem in your fleet or in your drivers or a group of people or whatever. What is that problem? And is it clear in your, if it's a real problem for you, make sure it's got its own section, that it's not buried, and that you test on it. Make sure there are at least a couple of, maybe 3 questions about that particular thing. It could be a final test, it could be in the duration, but the more important it is for you, make sure that that importance is reflected. And because we're doing it for, we don't know what's important, we're trying to determine the importance. And I just wanted to talk about Charles Waterfield sent me a document, and it's a DVIR inspection checklist. And it's a great example because it's a checklist that's, oh my gosh, it's quite a lot of, it's like 3 pages long, I think. Oh no, it's 2 pages long. And it is pretty wordy. I would consider checklists, so 2 or 3 page checklists are fine, but I would not use them for training. Those are things that you use for, what do you call it?
It's a job aid.
It's a job aid. Yeah. So I would never just put all of that information into a course and say, okay, read this, because people are not going to read it. However, if they want to know something about what to check for in the gauges of the vehicle, then I could just go straight to the gauges and go, okay, this is what I need to do. These are the things I need to do for the mirrors. These are the things I need. That's fine. That kind of detail. And I would probably organize it differently, but just make sure that checklists are great, but don't make them the training. That's after training as a job aid, or even if you don't have any training, at least give them some sort of information that they can use.
That actually leads into a follow-up question that I was going to put out there based on what Tiffany was just using as an example for testing or activities, exercises. And you talked about sort of using a schedule to identify something that's part of the activity for people. And that raised the question of whether open book testing is good or memory-based stuff. I think a lot of people get wrapped up in drivers needing to know everything under the sun and have it in their heads. But the reality is that's not how anybody works. And everybody has a series of job aids or crutches that they use in order to get through the day. So the example of the checklist fits into that perfectly. Like, it's not necessarily critical for the driver to have all of that stuff memorized. Sometimes what's more important is that they actually know how to use a particular set of tools to look things up. So you see this in hazmat all the time. Like, nobody's memorizing all of that stuff. So a good test is more about making sure that people know how to find the information. So can you talk a little bit about how you do some of that work, open book questions, open book activities, getting people to use some of those things to explore their ability to look things up?
Well, first, you have to introduce whatever tool that you want them to use, and you have to explain how to use it before you try and get them to do anything. So if you're looking at the emergency response guidebook, then you can't, you have to say, okay, this is how it's structured. Now, this information is here, this information is here, and now you can do a few test questions on, for this UN number, what emergency, like, what would you do for, I can't remember what the ERG says, but what would you do in this instance? Mm-hmm. But you definitely have to give a good explanation of what the tool is before you do anything else. And that's basically hazmat. Like that, our hazmat course and our dangerous goods course for Canada, both Canada and the US, talk about how to find the information, because you can't, until you can't look up the information and not, like, you're not going to know what it says. Even if you know how to look it up, you find a random UN number in the book, but then you don't know how to read the rest of the table. So it's really important to give people the structure and foundation of what they're looking for. The same with Schedule 1. Schedule 1, you kind of have to know what a major and a minor defect is in Canada, and in the DVIR, it's something completely different. You also have to know that not in the CVSA critical inspection items, you need to know that. Do you need to know, whether, if it's not on the form, do you put it on? That's one of those gaps where it's not always clear whether something should go on an inspection report. So that's the first step, is to explain the context of it. Just to go back to inspections, you have to get your CDL, you have to do an inspection from memory. So I think a lot of people will know, they won't know what they're really looking for. They'll know how to do the circle check and say the right things.
Yeah,
and I know that people have said, just memorize this script and you'll be fine. And they don't. And when we did our vehicle inspection course, I didn't want to just do that. I didn't want to just go around the vehicle and just check. I wanted people to know what they were actually looking for. So why are tires, why do you need to inspect tires so much? Like, what is the problem with those? Why do you need to, what's the problem with air brakes? And so when you get into that, then you start having a really good understanding of not only the issues with doing a vehicle inspection, but the issues with just the industry at large and the problems that people go through. Do you have time to do an inspection? Are you getting paid to do your inspection? What happens when your company doesn't do the vehicle repairs properly? All of these different things that come into play that you don't really think about when you're teaching people how to do, here's how you do your circle check.
Interesting.
And definitely that training aid to help them develop the habit over a course of weeks, Charles. Yes, that's exactly what I would use that for.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a future webinar. I'm writing that one down.
On job aids?
Job aids and building habits. Yes.
Oh, I love, I love job aids where there's like 3 steps or I've seen people, have stickers or decals on their trucks, and for, seat belts or like something really, really obvious. And I think that's a great thing to have, where you can stick it like right on the truck somewhere. It's something that you want everybody to remember. I think job aids are extremely useful. I love them. I think that, and I think that as long as you make sure that everybody has them, that like sometimes you can laminate them or just give them to them electronically. I think they're wonderful.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to be coming out of time soon, and there's one other section that I wanted to cover here. And we have touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to get both of you to sort of weigh in on pitfalls to avoid, things that you think people should stay away from. And Tiffany, do you want to start? Do you have things that to stay away from other than passive voice?
Other than passive voice, yeah, that's probably the biggest one because your training won't be clear. One thing that you definitely want to stay away from is referring to something as easy or simple, because it's not for everybody. And when somebody doesn't understand the concept and you're presenting it as being easy or simple, it can be really off-putting. So definitely stay away from that terminology in your training. The other thing that Jane's trained me to do is when you're writing content, you tend to write the way you think. And so when you're writing out the information, you're thinking it through, and you come to the most powerful or potent piece of information typically at the end. And a great trick for that is to take that last bit of information and put it at the beginning. And it's going to clarify the whole page or the piece of information and present them with the most important stuff first. So it's not necessarily a pitfall because the information's still there, but it's something you definitely want to look out for and think about presenting it earlier on.
Well, that's definitely an organizational thing, how you put in the content in the right order. People will go through it, and as they're figuring it out, they're writing out those different sections, and they have that big realization at the end, and then that becomes a summary, but it really should be an overview or an introduction at the beginning. And it needs to get moved around.
I almost always, when I'm editing somebody else's work, and Tiff is getting really good at this now because she doesn't do this anymore, but I look at it and go, no, that should be first. And it'll be the last page of a 150-page document, and I'll get there and be like, why isn't that first? That should be first. So I would say the last thing, like when you think you're finished a document or you're finished whatever your presentation is, look at the last thing you did and think, should that be first? Or what would happen if this was first?
Mm.
And it will generally give your audience more clarity about what you're trying to say, I would say.
That's a good way of approaching it. What would happen if this was first? But that kind of fits with a lot of things as well. Like, what would happen if we spent more time talking about this? What would happen if we spent less time on this? What would happen if we didn't expect people to memorize this, if we gave them a job aid instead? Yeah, what would happen if is a great question. What other pitfalls do you think people should avoid, Jane?
In creating a training, I think assuming knowledge is a big pitfall. Don't assume that people know anything, and you don't have to talk down to it. You don't have to be crappy in your reminders or anything like that. But if there's a step, at least mention the step. You don't know you have no idea what is going through other people's brains at any given time. So the clearer that you can make the step, and even in the, like if you have a list of things to inspect in a job aid, I would start at the top and just basically say, go through these steps in order. These are the steps. If you want to know what to do the inspection on, read on. You've got room. Like, it doesn't need to be 2 pages. If you're doing it online, like a virtual copy, then you can be as long as you want. But you could start with this is what is happening, and then you can let the user choose whether they want to dig deep into it. But you have to always remember, even the smallest steps, some of them can be really critical. That handoff of documentation, who you hand it off to or where it goes, in some cases, if you miss that bit, people are completely confused. Confusion. Here, listen to my sound bites today. Confusion is often the one piece of information that you're missing. And that's what I tend to ask myself is like, okay, I do not get that. There's one thing I'm missing. What is it? And that generally will answer the question.
Yeah, interesting. Well, there we go. Confusion is often the one piece you're missing. All right.
So when other people are confused, figure out what piece you're not communicating.
Yeah. Okay. You said something when we were prepping this. You also mentioned stats as being a tricky thing.
They age.
Yeah.
They age. You write something and it's wonderful in 2016.
Yeah.
Do I have to say more?
Stats are great as a way of establishing a foundation and going back to that why it matters part. They're really good for sort of highlighting the importance of an issue, but the pitfall is not updating. You've got to keep them fresh. If you're going to use stats, you've got to get updated versions pretty much as soon as they get updated. And one of the other things that I've noticed as well is that sometimes those stats stop supporting your case. It might be a stat that really made your case at a certain point in the past, but the latest version of that stat actually doesn't help you much at all.
A good example of that is the number of heavy vehicle crashes. In 2020, that went down. Like, it was trending down for a really long time. And then it went down in 2020, 2021, it was really low. And then, 2022,
Yeah.
And it was because of the pandemic. But you can't use those, vehicle crashes are trending downwards and blah, 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 because no, that's not actually true now.
Yeah. Something else that I always find tricky, or that I notice a lot of people kind of falling into this trap as well, is bad use of images. And we've got a whole thing in, like, a whole webinar on how to use PowerPoint and how to use images properly in your training decks. But I see a lot of people sort of slapping an image in for the sake of having an image, and it isn't really relevant. It might be clip art, or it might be a generic stock image, and maybe they try and have people in it, but it's a bunch of suits around a conference table smiling and looking at some presentation, and it just doesn't relate to anything that the audience is living. So those kind of images can really undercut the effectiveness of the content. And I think there's real value in doing images that actually help. And everybody's got a high quality camera on their phone now. Go and take pictures. Go into your own yard, take pictures, and use your own equipment, use your own people, and make it real. That will also, I think, really support that story, that it becomes something that people can relate to. It becomes something that's relevant for the drivers in their days. So okay, so we're pretty much out of time. We're just sort of coming to the end of the hour here. And if there are questions, certainly drop them into the chat. I'm realizing now that I never did the normal housekeeping at the beginning of this session, so I should have said, if you have a question, by all means, let us know. Retroactively, if you had a question, please go back and ask it, or ask it now. I don't know. That ship has sailed. But any last thoughts, Tiffany, on sort of things that you do to keep the content interesting and relevant for people?
Yeah, I would say just look around you. There's so much inspiration everywhere. We got inspiration for personal security course because I was watching a documentary on criminals, and they mentioned that everybody loves a really good villain. So we incorporated a villain into that course. And transportation of dangerous goods has a mystery theme, because I was looking at something online and it was a virtual murder mystery. And so we took that theme and applied it. And there's good stuff everywhere. And it's just a matter of trying things out and not being afraid to get a little messy with it.
Yeah. Okay. Jane?
Listen to Tiffany, because she remembers all the good stuff.
Sort your dollars and quarters.
Yeah. Well, I was taking notes as we went, because a lot of these pieces sort of fit together, and I really love the idea of stories being a way to make things real and help you to find gaps in the process, as you write that story, and the importance of doing it in not doing a passive voice, using an active voice to get that point across. You also mentioned, in terms of finding the level of detail, that you're better to start with too much information and then chop it back from there as the story dictates. So as the discussion went on, it really kind of reinforced the value of not looking at training as, how are we going to get through these 10 bullet points of content, but what is the story of somebody doing this? And then all of it sort of fits in from there. So I thought that was really useful. So I think we'll wrap it up here at this point. So thanks to both of you for taking the time to share your thoughts, and thanks to everybody else for attending.